Fernando Alonso has been a vocal critic of the way track limits are enforced, or rather, not enforced, on the opening laps of Formula 1 races in 2021. But having raised objections earlier in the season, he took an "if you can't beat them, join them" approach to this at the start of the Russian Grand Prix. In doing so, he exposed a weakness in the way the rules are applied. Alonso was not penalised for cutting across the Turn 2 runoff at high speed at the start of the race and rejoining in 4th place, which is the position he held at the entry to the corner. Those who recall Alonso's complaints about the advantage gained by rivals in similar circumstances earlier in the season might be tempted to accuse him of hypocrisy. But we're going to explain why he was in the right, according to the way the rules were laid out. The bigger question is whether that application of the rules is correct, and there's no doubt at all that Alonso was partly motivated by a desire to make a point he feels has been ignored previously, and of course he also gained a competitive advantage. Let us know in the comments what you think of Alonso's Turn 2 move and what F1 should do about this in the future. To understand Alonso's position, we have to look back to the 2 races at the Red Bull Ring earlier this season. After the second of those, the Austrian Grand Prix, he hit out at rivals, abusing the runoff area at the exit of Turn 1 on the first lap. This was on the basis not only of allowing drivers taking the outside line and carrying speed across the runoff area before rejoining ahead of where they should be, but also the advantage that they gain on the subsequent straight by being able to pick up the tow from cars ahead. Alonso has not only complained about this publicly, but he's also raised it in drivers' briefings. When he has done so, he's been given short shrift for pointing out what he sees as a problem that should have been fixed. After the start in Austria, he made some sarcastic comments over the radio, showing how unhappy he was at the time to be disadvantaged by rivals doing something that he has previously questioned. He also mentioned to the team that if the FIA is, as he put it, happy with track limits, he will take advantage elsewhere. Nobody was penalised in Austria, and Alonso has continued to beat this particular drum. That's unsurprising, given he's a driver with a knack for picking the right place at the start and feels that one of his strengths is being negated by drivers capitalising on lenient track limits. In Russia, he was as good as his word about the fact he would have to take advantage of something he dislikes in the future. This video is sponsored by F1 Authentics, the home for official F1 memorabilia. You can get the ultimate F1 memorabilia from sports memorabilia specialists, including sports artwork, signed photos, authentic mini helmets. There's even race-worn kit like gloves and race suits, car parts, and for those who like their memorabilia to be practical, there are even F1 wheel rim tables. Visit f1authentics.com to find out more about what they do. It was obvious that Alonso was plotting something when he trialled the manoeuvre on a reconnaissance lap before the race, as spotted by Sky Sports F1's Karin Chandok. But just because there was an element of premeditation doesn't change the fact that it's legal. To understand why, you have to consider the 2 rules, one written and one simply agreed between the drivers and race director Michael Massey. The first is in the race director's notes, which are issued at each Grand Prix. For Sochi, this stated that each time any car fails to negotiate Turn 2 by using the track and has any part of the car over the first orange curb elements prior to the apex, or passes completely to the left of the orange apex sausage at Turn 2, they must then rejoin the track by driving around the array of blocks as indicated by the arrows, before then rejoining the track at Turn 2. Alonso fulfilled that criteria as he did run around the array of blocks that effectively constitute a chicane before rejoining the track and racing on. So, indeed, did the other 3 drivers who also cut across the runoff, Pierre Gasly, Antonio Giovinazzi and Max Verstappen, although Gasly didn't do so entirely successfully as he took a chunk out of one of the blocks while doing so. The second is an unwritten rule, one of the many necessary deviations from the letter of the general purpose regulations to deal with specific situations, and is known by all drivers and teams. This is that when drivers do this in the early corners of races at tracks where there are potential gains to be made, they are obliged to rejoin behind the driver that they were behind when they left the track. In Alonso's case, that was George Russell, who he did indeed slot in behind. Massey said that this rule was introduced at the driver's behest following the 2019 French Grand Prix at Paul Ricard, after Racing Point driver Sergio Perez cut across the runoff area in the turn 3 to 5 right-left-right sequence and gained an advantage. Alonso, of course, was not in F1 at this point, so wasn't part of these discussions. In that instance, Perez did cut around a bollard marking the required route for rejoining, but still gained positions, which meant he was given a 5-second penalty. It was felt this created a lack of clarity, as Perez did exactly what he was meant to do, but still got penalised given there was no formal guidance for where you should rejoin. Given the way the rules are laid out and enforced, what Alonso did was entirely fair. These rules apply to all 20 drivers, so it is a level playing field and Alonso is perfectly entitled to do what he did. You might disagree with that, but the problem is not Alonso in this case. While he did exceed track limits, it's common for there to be interpretations of the rules in place for specific situations at every event, so what he did was legal and therefore perfectly acceptable. And given Alonso's attempts to get the way the rules are enforced changed before, you can't blame him for taking advantage. The real advantage that Alonso gained by cutting across the runoff was not that he gained while off the track. After all, he slotted in behind Russell in 4th place, and that's exactly where he was before he went off, so there was no gain there, but it's a different kind of advantage that Alonso was able to take. It's understood that Alonso had talked about the situation before the race with his team. Knowing that the runoff area is available, it's possible for a driver to commit to the outside line approaching turn 2, which can be a strategy that usually backfires given the profile of the corner, thanks to it narrowing due to the second part of the corner, sometimes referred to as turn 2A. But with the runoff rule as it is, Alonso was able to commit to the outside, get up to 4th behind Russell, and then immediately dive for the runoff, without the risk of either contact or being hung out to dry on the outside line in the narrowing corner. Of course, he did this knowing that he was almost certainly going to bail out of it. The genius of Alonso's approach was to realise the potential advantage of this, as it effectively eliminates the risk of being on the outside line and allowed him to gain positions simply based on where he was entering the corner. So what if it's not the intent of the rules, what counts is the wording and the way they are enforced? The way it impacts the early seconds of Alonso's race is very clear. He starts on the right hand side of the grid in 6th place and doesn't make a great start, falling behind Edd Straw. But having sat in Stroll's toe, he brakes to the far left of the track to move to the outside line and is then able to pass the Aston Martin, Daniel Ricciardo and Lewis Hamilton to take 4th before committing to the runoff. Without the rules allowing him to then take the runoff, go through the blocks and rejoin where he left, it's unlikely he would still have been 4th at turn 3 had he gone through the corner. But all that matters is that this is absolutely in keeping with the way the rules were being enforced at Sochi and on first laps in general, and therefore is an intelligent way to approach the start. But it could become problematic in the future if too many drivers attempt to take advantage of it. Of course, that's not a problem for Alonso to solve, he has after all already tried to. It's down to the rule makers and the race director to ensure it is kept under control, and perhaps listen to the complaints in the first place. After all, Alonso can quite justifiably point out that he has raised objections to the way runoff is policed at the start of races, so he has every right to take advantage of it, given he feels he's been disadvantaged in the past. He doesn't like it, but he has to go along with it, and therefore, from a competitive perspective, would be, to use his own word, stupid not to take advantage of it. In this case, his strategy didn't pay off as well as it might have done, but only because Alonso lost 2 positions later in the lap, the first of those being to Stroll at turn 4. But it does show a potential limitation of what is, on paper, a practical and easy way to apply the rule. After all, at certain tracks it does allow a certain degree of premeditation and allow a driver to gain simply by their position into the corner without having to go through it. Remember, this interpretation is not only used at Sochi, as while it's a track where it's particularly open to being used to a driver's advantage, there are others where it's also a powerful weapon. This means it's an interpretation of the rules that may need a little rethink, although it will not be easy given it's necessary to account for drivers being forced onto the runoff. In fact, that's exactly what happened to Giovinazzi as he took to the runoff after contact with Mick Schumacher. Calling for literal enforcement of the rules makes sense on paper, but reality is more chaotic and it needs a delicate touch to ensure it is done correctly. Let us know if you believe F1 needs to rethink its approach to drivers exceeding track limits at first corners in the comments. And if you enjoyed this look at what happened at Sochi, even if you don't like what Alonso did, remember to like and subscribe.